Welcome to It's a Woman's World, a show which discusses any and all topics under the sun from a woman's point of view. Hosted today by Dr. Susan Strauss.
Hi, welcome to It's a Woman's World. I'm Susan Strauss, and co-hosting with me today is
Nadia Jordana.
We've got a very interesting program, including two wonderful guests from a nonprofit organization called Gender Justice. We have Lisa Stratton, who is an attorney with Gender Justice, and Jill Gaulding, who is also an attorney with Gender Justice. And greetings, we're glad you're here to join us today.
Thank you so much for inviting us.
My pleasure.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
I'm glad you're here. And Nadia, it's always fun to co-host with you, so I'm glad you're here again as well.
Very happy to be here. And let's start off today by having you tell us what is gender justice? What is gender justice?
Well, we are a nonprofit organization, as Susan mentioned. We have been around we're coming up on our 5-year anniversary, which we're very proud to say. Starting a nonprofit from scratch has been a big job. So we're proud that we're still here.
Yes, for sure.
And we are focused on a big goal, which is to eliminate gender barriers. And what we mean by that is a broad definition of gender. And any time that there is a presumption being made about a person based on their sex, their sexual orientation, or their gender identity, we would take a look at that. And we work on multiple levels. We work as lawyers. Jill does amazing work in court, and I have a background in that too. We represent individuals in cases in court, trying to get them a remedy for discrimination based on one of those, their gender. And we also then work on fixing the laws at the legislature when they don't work.
Great.
And adding new ones where needed.
Well, I think sometimes when people hear the term gender justice, they often are thinking more, well, this is all about women and women's justice. And maybe you can address that. I know that you also work with men, so maybe you can just identify what you see with gender justice. You've identified gender and looking at sex stereotypes, trans, GLBT, but tell us a little bit about that. Do you work with both men and women?
We do, actually, and like Lisa said, our focus is gender, and that just works for us. I mean, we could have picked, we sometimes refer to it as slices. I don't know whether that makes sense to people, but you know, there are different forms of oppression, and you can focus on different things within those. And it's great to have people in different groups, you know, each having a different focus, and then you end up working together. But the focus that we wanted to have was on gender, and maybe one of the reasons for that, I think we were talking before the show about something called the pink locker room.
Yes.
Maybe helps exemplify, you know, why we do what we do, the way that we do it. The pink locker room is this misogynistic, you know, sexist and homophobic institution that's basically about putting people down because of gender. So it's basically like saying you're a girl or you're a sissy, and those two things are so closely linked. A tiny bit of background there, if that doesn't make sense to you. A pink locker room would be only the visitors' locker room. So the one that I'm thinking of is at the University of Iowa in Iowa City.
I read about it.
Where I used to be a law professor, and they actually rebuilt it in the year 2005, so it's not some anachronistic thing.
But it's still pink, isn't it?
It's absolutely still pink. They have pink tiles, pink carpet, pink everything. Somebody called it Barbie's dream house on acid. Although actually the color, as I've seen it, they won't let me in there, but the color is actually more muted. But the idea behind it, that you can have, you know, it's a public university and it's building a gender slur right into the campus physically, you know, that's still okay to put people down. It basically turns girl into a 4-letter word or a slur word. But when you think about why it's a slur, you see the interconnection there. I mean, is it homophobic? Absolutely. Is it about putting down women for being women? Absolutely. It's so intertwined. When I was a professor down there in 2005, when I found out that they were rebuilding this horrible monument to misogyny, I tried to fight back in every way that I could, and I reached out to every group that I thought would be interested. And it was amazing actually how little interest there was. And maybe part of that is because people are used to thinking it's okay to have gender slurs. And part of it might be that people don't really understand the nature of the harm. And I think that was something we were hoping to talk about today, cognitive bias, you know, how our brains actually work and absorb stereotypes, and then what the real world repercussions of that are.
Yeah, you mentioned cognitive bias, and when I was thinking about that and when I first read about the story, and I read about it somewhere else, and my first impression was, oh, that's kind of a cool thing. That gets an advantage on the It didn't even occur to me. Is that cognitive bias where it didn't even occur to me that that was a slur against women and the whole thing that goes with it until I read later on, and my eyes were open. It's like, oh my gosh, I didn't even notice.
Yeah.
Because we're used to the
Yes.
association that a negative association for a male is either female or being quote unquote
We've accepted
sissy
it all
Yes.
our
or
lives.
gay.
Yes.
Yes, that we all know that's one down. That's the key. That's what makes it oppressive.
But we swim in it. I
Yeah,
mean,
absolutely.
it's like breathing oxygen, and you get so that you don't see it. And I think sometimes you don't see it. I remember one of my daughters had said to me, "Oh, Mother, I wish you wouldn't even have taught me about all this stuff because it's so painful." And I said, "Yes, it is painful, but you have to be able to see it in order to bring the change."
And that is so important, I think. And I often, when we talk about the pink locker room, it always jumps in my head. So I've said it before, but an example of how deeply ingrained it is from my life. I have a son, which has been brought an interesting
Yes,
difference to my feminism, I think, opened my eyes to the ways in which boys are limited and
Yes.
held back by gender stereotypes. And he came home from soccer practice at one point and said that the coach had said they were playing like girls.
Ooh. So what did you do about that?
I talked to other parents, and I was pleased that actually all of the parents seemed aghast.
And how old was your son, excuse me, when he said
was
that?
12.
Okay, so and he got it.
He got it.
Okay,
That's
and so
why.
what happened then?
Although, as he says, I've gotten a lot of tickets from the gender justice police. And the coach was a young man. He was a college player.
Yeah.
And, when we think about sexual assault on campus
Yes,
and
that's
all
right.
of these issues, they are not anachronistic issues. They are with us today
They
in
are.
our youth.
Yep.
And that's what we are trying to combat. In part by doing also, I mentioned that we do cases and that we work on policy at the legislature, but we also like to do training to go into a setting and to help people look at this as how do we solve a problem. It's not always about who's the bad person and
Yes.
blaming someone for this. It's in all of us is our message.
Yes.
And there are ways steps we can take, and they aren't all that hard, to start correcting it. We just have to be aware it exists.
What kind of places and organizations, institutions that you do training?
Well, gosh, we've done schools. Jill has done a training for educators in schools. We have trained on a more concrete basis physicians and their staffs, in part about some of the new rights that we accomplished with the Women's Economic Security Act in Minnesota,
Yes, we
for
need
example.
to talk about that, yeah.
Yeah.
So we have gone out and spread the message about what is the new law and what does it require. So not so much cognitive bias, but we do trainings of different kinds.
And what can you tell us about the Women's Economic Security Act, which of course is new to Minnesota, and it's my understanding that you both had an active role in getting that bill passed. Is that correct?
Yes, gender justice was extremely involved, and it came up very quickly. Last year, the House leadership decided that they wanted to do something like this, to do a package of bills that would try to make an impact on women's economic security and the wage gap. And if you look at all of the bills, we started out with something like 12. They were all, in some way, you can connect them to an attempt to narrow the wage gap. And that includes the items that I worked most on were the ones that relate to employment, because Jill and I have both a past as employment law professors and litigators, lawyers in court. So I focused on the ones that were about pregnancy leave in the workplace, and we increased the amount of parenting leave in Minnesota from 6 weeks to 12 weeks, which matches federal law. What's important about it is that employers between the sizes of 21 and 50 are now covered under state law.
Which is a lot of employers
Yes,
that
yes.
size.
So we basically took the federal law requirement down. It applies when you have 50 or more. So now it's 21 or more. You have 12 weeks of unfortunately unpaid. So we are still on the agenda with getting some paid parental leave. We expanded the reasons it can be taken to include pregnancy leave. So you can take unpaid leave to deal with pregnancy complications or issues or appointments. We had always, Minnesota was ahead of the curve and had a law that said that women who are in nursing can take time, small breaks at work, and to accommodate the need to pump when they go back to work. You know, so many of us with such short and unpaid leaves end up going back to work when you still have an infant really nursing.
Yes.
And you need that to keep, for the baby's health, the mother's health, we all know all the reasons. And women are often forced to choose between actually even keeping their jobs or being able to pump
Yes.
at work. And we had a client,
Yeah.
very heroic woman, who we brought a case for her under that law, the Minnesota state law, because she was fired, because she said, I'm going to take these short breaks to pump. So we brought that case, and then when this Women's Economic Security Act came up, we said, here we go, perfect
Yes.
opportunity.
Good.
That's a nice example, actually, of our
Yes.
model as a nonprofit, because we were bringing that case to find a remedy for that woman. But part of the reason why we were trying to help her was because there was actually some uncertainty about what remedy she could have. I mean, lawyers talk about a right without a remedy being a bad thing or an impossible thing, but this was an area where it really did look like there was a right without a remedy, and her employer certainly thought that was the case. He thought he could just fire her. Because, and we could come back to this later maybe in terms of stereotyping and how that relates to the employment or wage gap. He actually said that he thought it was unprofessional for her to pump at the workplace. Like
Even
that was just a
think that way
clash,
in this
right?
day and
Well, I
age.
know
And
it.
this
Yeah.
is, 2014. But that was a sort of full circle there, because we were bringing her case for her, but then the woman was able to tell her story. Her name is Tara Duncan, very effectively in front of the legislature to help Lisa help get WESA passed, the Women's Economic Security Act. And then the training that Lisa mentioned earlier with the physicians
Yes.
was actually related to that too, because doctors are often where women go when they're not sure what their rights are
Yes.
around nursing. They ask the pediatrician or they ask their OBGYN,
Oh.
right?
Who
They
are
don't
you-
know a
who are you
lawyer,
seeing
but they
every
know a
week, right?
doctor.
I want to make sure that I know what time it goes fast, and what I really do want to bring into our discussion is the whole idea about cognitive bias. And I know there was an interesting mix in bringing the two of you together. Jill, you had said you came from a science background, having gotten a degree at MIT, and Lisa, you came more from the civil rights, humanistic kind of background, and that it's been just a nice nexus of the two of you. So talk to us about cognitive bias in the short amount of time we have left.
Well, it's a fancy word for something that's pretty straightforward, really. It's about how efficient our brain is in making assumptions about the world. Sometimes people think it must be a bad thing. It's got the word bias in there, and obviously the way it works out in the world is a problem at times. But it's not any different, really, from standing on a street corner and seeing something coming towards you that's red and being able to figure out, oh, that's a car, and it's going to continue towards me, and if I step out into the street, having an assumption about what happens.
That's where it has its roots then, is
Yeah, right. It's
instinct.
your brain working like a brain. You want your brain to do that sort
Yeah.
of thing. You want your brain to make assumptions, and quickly and without having to spend a lot of cognitive energy on it. But if it's not a red car coming towards you that you're thinking about, but men and women in the workplace and making those quick assumptions about what men and women are like, then it is a problem. And I think our laws rightfully expect people in the workplace and in other institutions to pay attention to the risks that cognitive bias puts out in front of us. And sometimes it's a really simple solution. So an example a lot of people like to give has to do with orchestras.
Oh, yes.
Right? Have you heard that example?
Yes, I use it
mean,
when I
there used to be an idea that men were natural musicians and women weren't, and that natural idea led to women, even after the civil rights laws were passed, so they couldn't say, as they used to, no women in the orchestra. But somehow the women just didn't get in. They just didn't seem to be good enough. But after they started having the women do their auditions behind a screen, so they couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman,
I didn't know they did that.
right. All of a sudden, you can joke, either the women got better, or or we were better able to
They got a lot
perceive,
better.
right, the actual merit. And some people call that debiasing. It can also be as simple as taking a name off of the resumes when you're reviewing resumes, so you're not distracted in a sense by those
name.
stereotypes, and you can look at people's actual merit.
That would
for
cover more than
gender
one
and
stereotype.
race.
That's what I was just
Yes.
going to say.
Yes.
It's so
Instantly,
important
yeah,
to say
the
that,
race as well.
that, as all the current events are teaching
Yes.
us, that
Yeah.
there is the instantaneous presumptions
Yeah.
that happen that we may not even be
Yeah.
aware of are so can be so harmful, and that they're different based on race and class and age and all of these other, it's all a mix there triggering in our
Yeah,
brains.
it is.
Right.
Well, we've talked about cognitive bias, and we're sort of implying to the unconscious or the implicit bias that's associated with it. And I would guess that many of our viewers are thinking, oh, I'm not biased, I'm not sexist, I'm not racist. And I think many of us work very hard not to be.
We try not to be.
That's right. But there is this unconscious part that all of us have, no matter what. Can you talk to us about the unconscious biases that are there and how it negatively impacts, and we'll use gender because that's what you're all about today, how it can negatively impact women and men in school and at work?
What some of the research, the real world research shows is that when a woman in the workplace becomes pregnant, talks about possibly having a family, has a child, and even worse, has a second child, is often immediately assumed to be less competent, a less dedicated employee, someone who doesn't want to travel, someone who wouldn't want to work overtime or put in any extra hours,
And puts
less
her family
dependable, puts her family first, right? All of those things, and those are triggered at that very unconscious
And
level.
they're big.
And from that point forward, that is contributing to the wage gap, the perception of maybe she's not the right person to look to for the next promotion, maybe she doesn't want to travel to be the regional manager, all of those things come into play. So very clear impact on women in the workplace. But if you look even further, it also impacts men in the workplace. Now, the studies show that men tend to get a positive bump when they have children. In perception about their competence and their dedication, all of those things. You know, now he's providing for a family.
He'll be more
and he'll be more stable, secure, all of those things. You could just tick them off, right? Because
Oh,
the
yeah.
stereotypes are right
there,
there
yeah.
for us to
You
access.
won't be coming in with a hangover.
Right.
And then, but if he shows, this is what I think is the most interesting part, because it shows one of the ways in which these things can harm men too. Because we always think of, oh, men getting all the benefit and women all the harm, and that's, you know, on a macro level, yes, predominantly, but when a man shows an interest in the workplace, in caretaking, you know, I'm going to leave early to go to my kid's soccer game, not my golf tournament, they can face some of the same unconscious biases
Yes.
that they're then sort
And
of.
actually, golf might be okay in a lot of situations.
Oh, yes.
It fits into
Yes.
the stereotype of a good worker, which is still very
Especially
gendered.
if they're with a client.
1950s.
Yes.
Yep.
I think those are good pieces, and I know you had a question about something called
Pedestal
Pedestal-
sexism.
yeah.
I've heard the term recently, never heard it before. Is it a new term, and what is it?
I think that's a term we invented for Twitter, so put a little pound sign in front of it. But we were trying to quickly capture our perspective on something other people often refer to as benign
Yes.
stereotypes or sexism, and we didn't want to use that term because we knew from the science it's actually not benign.
Yeah.
So an example of that would be something like women are naturally more nurturing. Fits right in with what Lisa was saying. You know, it's because we think women are more nurturing that we assume that, you know, once there are kids on the scene, they're going to leave the workplace and go nurture their children. But what the studies have shown is if you can measure the level of those kinds of attitudes in a person that seem benign, that seem positive towards women, that same person who has a high result in terms of benign sexism will also be more likely to discriminate in ways that harm women. It's not at all benign.
Sorry to end this. I hate to because it's been such an interesting topic on gender, which of course is inherent in all of us. Nadia, thanks for co-hosting, and a special thank you to you, Lisa, and to you, Jill, with Gender Justice. And please stay with us for Uma Junga. She's going to create something special for our taste buds. Bye-bye.